my co-host, is going to present on another part, but I'm going to focus today on anxiety, which is something we're all dealing with at this time, and some tools that may help. But before we jump in, always going to talk about trends this week. And many people in DPS and people in others have already been going to school. But one of the trends seeing around school is kids that enjoyed and did well in school are still transitioning pretty well to an online school environment. Those that have been having trouble before with school are continuing to have that trouble. And there is more, especially with high schoolers, seeing a lot more burnout and the switch being a little harder with more of the high schoolers I'm seeing. And another trend that I think is hitting parents and everyone, we're all having emotions, but I'm seeing the emotions hit harder, kind of like waves. And there are definitely some waves going on and people feel it, waves of fatigue, sadness, waves of depression, waves of anxiety. And that's why we're focusing a little more on those topics today too. And then to honor to the third kind of trend that kind of seeing is we've been with our families now sheltering in place for about 3 to 4 weeks for some people. And some of those family dynamics are coming out even more. And so just family issues are starting to come, getting a little more on each other's nerves, and dealing with family is sort of part of what's coming up more this week. And so these are some of the larger trends, and just to be aware of in yourself, if they're starting to come up with you, to start thinking about what can I do to help change some of these trends or deal with what's coming up. And so with that in mind, want to focus a little more on anxiety. And what I've done is sort of devoted much of my life to trying to help figure out how to help those dealing with anxiety. And sort of looked at all the models out there, read literature, spent my life trying to understand, and based on that, developed a model to try to help the age of COVID, kids running in. Develop a model that kind of understands what do we need to help people who are anxious. And that model is called Learning to Face Your Fears. And I'm going to briefly take you through the model and some of those key skills. And then, as I said, we're going to apply that model and try to all eat a gross food together and to see it come to life. So the first thing in that model is it's called the F step, or feeling anxious. And what we need to do, and before we start any anxiety work, we need to have an idea that that's what we're dealing with, that we are feeling anxious. In the same way I say, I'm from California. If no one told you about these things called earthquakes, and all of a sudden you were in the middle of an earthquake and you didn't know what was going on, you would start panicking. And so being able to identify that this is what I'm dealing with, an earthquake, it's still scary, but it helps our brain organize what we need to do. And that's what I believe the job of feelings are, is to help us organize around the feeling of what we need to do. So when it comes to anxiety, what are some of those telltale signs to start seeing in yourselves? And we look at these things along 4 dimensions, and you can think of this for any feeling or need state. But to be aware of anxiety, if you're hearing thoughts about what can go wrong, the doom and gloom, and you can't let go of those thoughts, those are probably more anxious thoughts. If you're having some of these feelings, you probably will be dealing with some anxiety too. Stress, overwhelmed, upset, frustrated, angry, probably some familiar thoughts. And if they're there, feelings, and if they're there, they're probably some anxiety too. And anxiety's job is to try to get us to avoid. And so anytime you're avoiding something, there's probably some anxiety to it. So a good tip I share with parents, if you have anything on your to-do list that has been there more than 2 to 3 days, And it's not just I don't have time to do it, but all these things keep coming up. I would encourage you to wonder if it's a little more anxiety related. And then at the same time, the last piece in terms of physiology, our anxiety's job is to try to keep us safe. So it's going to turn on any part of our body to do that. So anytime you're really locked in thinking, you're sweating, your heart rate is going, you're feeling nauseous, headaches, those might be signs of dealing with a lot of anxiety. And anxiety is sort of a catchphrase. And when I'm working with people, sometimes that same thing, they're dealing with a lot of feelings. They're dealing with a lot of feelings and they label it as anxiety. Some of it is, and others might be other. But after we figure out that that's what's going on, the light bulb goes off, it's anxiety. Especially with our anxiety, it's good to put numbers to it. Because based on how strong it is, we might do different things. So if something's a little bit making me anxious, we might try to push through. But if something's really making me anxious, like if there's a cobra in the room, our ability to not react from an anxious place is going to go offline. And we're going to start acting from our anxious response, which is fight or flight. And so we do need some tools that do help us when we're feeling anxious to get what I call our smart brain back. And I call these things calming tools. And calming tools, you'll see a whole bunch. I scanned all the literature. Calming tools are the things we can do in the moment to reduce our physiological arousal and get our smart brain back to then do better with our anxious feelings and anxious desires to avoid or to fight. And so the one I want to go over today, you can see them all. We don't have time to go over them. But I do want to highlight a good calming skill has these properties. I call them the 5 rules. It has to work to calm you down. It can't draw attention to you. It has to be safe. It has to be portable. And when it comes to anxiety, it can't lead to distraction avoidance. So that's where distraction and taking a couple minutes out is a great tool. But if 5 minutes of a show leads to a whole binge and you've never gotten back to it, then maybe distraction isn't the right tool for you. And timeouts and removing ourselves from senses is another one that can also be helpful when we're starting to feel really anxious or overwhelmed. But the one I want to teach you tonight is out of all these, your breath is one of your most powerful. And so what I want to teach you, it's called diaphragmatic breathing. And diaphragmatic breathing looks something like this. You want to breathe in like, let's picture the best dessert you can imagine right now, because we maybe all had dinner, maybe some of you hadn't. But imagine you're breathing in the best dessert you ever could imagine through your nose, and then you're going to blow out like you would on hot soup. So let's do that right now. Let's breathe in that yummy dessert. And now let's blow out on hot soup. 2 more times. Breathe in that yummy dessert. Blow out on hot soup. Breathe in that yummy dessert. Blow out on hot soup. So that's one way. And my wish for every adult, every parent, anyone who deals with anxiety is by the end, and what you want to have are at least 2 ways to calm yourself that you can use moving forward. And after we've calmed ourselves and we have our smart brain kind of operating, the next thing we want to do with anxiety is learn to acknowledge what it's telling us and then learn how to talk back to it. And that's such an important thing because a lot of people might tell you you should block out your anxiety, pretend it's not there. That's actually the worst thing you could do. Because remember, I'm starting to talk about anxiety is an alarm system. And that alarm system is trying to protect you from something. And if you ignore an alarm system, it doesn't want to go away. It wants to work harder to get your attention. So we want to try to listen and hear what our worry brain is telling us and acknowledge it. Something to the effect, I hear you, worry brain, telling me whatever it is. And so just to kind of practice that, imagine I said to you all right now, you have to go and sing the national anthem at the host Nuggets game. And I want you to start thinking and hearing, what is your worry brain telling you about that scenario? And if you're listening with your partner or anyone, turn to them right now and just share, what does your worry brain tell you about that scenario? And so my worry brain is telling me, I have a horrible voice, everyone's gonna laugh at me, it's gonna be a disaster, I'm gonna forget the words, I'm gonna be a laughing stock. These are all things my anxiety is telling me. And it might also tell me all the safety behaviors or things to do to try to keep myself safe. And we want to be aware of those things. And after we do that, the next step we want to do is to start to poke holes in those arguments. And so again, when I've looked at the literature and scanned and done everything, I've kind of seen that there's 4 bigger key ways and a lot of little ways underneath that are really important that help challenge and that we can use to talk back to our anxiety. And this is a harder thing right now, especially with COVID, because some of this stuff is a real biological threat to our life. But we can give our anxiety some perspective. We can give it some evidence to challenge it. We can challenge it based on our values and what we care about, or we can look for the tricks it's using to try to control our behavior and call them out. So the couple I want to point in each of these dimensions, especially for parents, to be kind to yourself in the process, is, will this matter in 15 years? And what I mean by that, if you're worrying about right now, whether my kid is eating the right food, whether they're on the computer too much right now, I want you to fast forward in 15 years. Do you think you're going to remember that night they were watching too much TV? And you probably won't. And things like that that you realize might not matter, maybe you can challenge your anxiety a little more to let go. And the other part of anxiety, to remember, it's always going to point out the bad and the danger. So anytime you can point out the positivity, the resiliency, the good that could happen, you're seeing the good. That's a great way to challenge your anxiety. And then going through, anxiety is always going to present arguments with no proof. You are definitely going to get COVID. You will die from COVID. And again, anxiety is going to tell you things like that. But where's the proof? Where's the evidence that's going to happen to you? And you can look at the data to kind of understand what are the real probabilities of that to help you stay informed and say, am I going to let a less than 1% chance keep me worried and on edge with everything I do? And maybe, again, we all want to be safe and do things, yet at the same time, we want to look at proof to guide behavior. And that's one of the ones. I have a huge flying phobia. And I say to my anxiety, where's the proof I'm going to blow up this time? And then we can look at our values and what's important. But the other thing to be aware of is anxiety is going to use certain tricks against us. And these are some of the tricks I see more right now during the age of COVID, that anxiety seems to be using to control people's behavior and to get them to listen. So one thing it's getting to do to people right now is to worry way off into the future and to get us already thinking about way beyond where we are now, and to say you should be worried about it. And therefore, you should stay in a heightened state of worry right now. It loves to use the deep down trick. Deep down, you know the truth. Deep down, you know what's going to happen to you. It loves to be a broken record and just repeat itself in your mind. It loves to get you caught up in the thing in front of you, the shiny object, to get you to avoid what you're worried about. And if you ever hear in your head, but, most likely that's your anxiety trying to convince you not to do something. And so what we want to do too, and what we can do with our anxiety, is be on the lookout. And when we see these tricks, we can go, silly anxiety, those tricks used to work. They're not going to work against me right now to control my behavior. And then the last thing we have to do with anxiety is around, I guess, psychological anxiety. I should make that distinction. Things that are biologically we're afraid of, like cobras, like COVID, we want to respect and do things that our anxiety wants us to do. But things like tests, things like being vulnerable, talking to people, we want to figure out how to overcome. So here are some skills that then help us do what our anxiety doesn't want us to do. The more we practice things, the more we learn about them, help reduce avoidance. The more we kind of muster our courage and know what helps us be courageous, the more we learn to break things down to smaller steps. And then the last one is whatever we're anxious about, to come up with ways to solve around it that don't involve avoidance. And so with that in mind, then the last thing we do after we do an anxiety challenge is we want to look back and see what happened. Was it right? And usually what we'll find with anxiety, it was wrong. But if it was right, and especially if it's a psychological fear, we will see that we survived. And the last thing, anxiety doesn't like us to lose. So it might punish us after we do a challenge. And we want to be on the lookout for it and not let it work. So now I know I jumped a whole bunch of skills in a very brief time and go back and explain anxiety a lot. But I do want us to see how they come alive and how you can use them in your own life. So I hope many of you went to the fridge and grabbed yourself a gross food. If not, I will give you 1 minute to do so, and then we're going to see these come alive. And so I have in front of me a Kalamata olive. And first question, I'm going to take you through the series of questions I do when I help adults or kids or anyone start to challenge your anxiety. So hopefully, because this is a food that is actually gross, your anxiety is starting to send you some messages. And so the first thing I want to ask you is, what number is your anxiety right now on a scale of 1 to 10? And if your anxiety is starting to get above a 5, we want to start to use those calming skills to make sure our smart brain is there. And so let's just take a minute. I'm going to do a nice breath, and I'm going to visualize myself at the beach in a nice calm place before I eat this olive, which is now a 5 to me. Now I want you to hear the worry thoughts in your head. What is anxiety telling you? Mine is telling me it's going to be gross, I can't do it, it's going to make me gag, it's going to make me throw up. And so now hear your own worry thoughts. And now I'm going to be everyone's collective worry brains, and I want you to talk back to me. So here I go. I'm going to share a worry thought, and based on what you saw before, I'll even go back to it. You have to have the last word. Don't eat this food right now. It's going to be so gross. No, deep down you know it is. Don't do it. It's going to make you puke and throw up. Don't do it. You know the truth. This is going to be a disaster. So hopefully you found and you use some of these tools to talk back to it. Now we're going to do, and for this one, if you're worried about puking or really having that, I would encourage you to have a drink or a trash can. That's problem solving without avoiding. We could even go to Google and look up how to make this challenge easier. We're not going to do that, but there are tricks that help eat gross foods to make it easier. And I will think about and ask you to think about what helps you to have courage to do things. And for me, that's my kids. Trying to teach them and have them live a life without anxiety is why I do this and push myself and them. So without further ado, folks, go for it. Oh, still as gross as ever. And the last thing, congratulations. You all did your first challenge. We do want to look at what happened. Was it as hard as you thought? Was your anxiety right? Is your worry brain now punishing you and saying something like, yes, you could do this, but you couldn't sing in public, or you couldn't eat this food out? Is it trying to stay in control? And your job is to not let it win. So those are some of the anxiety skills. And I want you to think about, as your anxiety starts to torment you during this time and try to take control, this is a great time to try to use some of these skills to fight back. And we do want to be thoughtful about our behavior. And maybe COVID-related stuff might be too hard to try to challenge your anxiety, but maybe other things is still a good time to practice the skills and get used to them. And then what we do is then we start practicing and designing things, and these are called exposures. And I kind of came up with a bumper sticker, and that bumper sticker is an exposure a day keeps the anxiety at bay. And then we start bringing that to the mountain. The last thing before I wrap up and pass it over to my colleague is what you could be talking with your kids about based on trends and what you're dealing with yourself. First off, to keep remembering that we're in the middle of the worst marathon ever, and how to keep pacing and doing things in a way that are sustainable. To keep making room for the lemons as well as the lemonade. And now that we're all experiencing more waves, to keep talking with yourself about better ways to ride the wave, and to remember that waves have some temporariness. And to keep talking about where people are at with COVID and where you're at, and keep tuning into what you might need, and keep making sure everyone is kind of talking about it and coming up with what we need to do to keep fighting Voldemort. So thank you for your time, and I will share one other thing every week. I'm asking my kids how we're doing. And again, they're letting me know that they still are enjoying some free time. My little guy would like a little more attention. My daughter has been doing a lot of trying to help in the role of also doing some of the schoolwork and helping everyone out. And she appreciates that, but also wants to be out of that role. So these are all things I'm starting to just be aware of and we're talking about. We might be able to fix some and work on, and others we're having conversations about why. So thank you, and I would love people to just think about, based on this talk, something they might stop doing in their life based on what they heard, something you're going to keep doing, pat yourself on the back, and something you're going to start doing. So now I'm going to pass it to my colleague, and thank you. That was a lot in a very brief time.
Well, hello to all of you, and thank you, Scott. We are going to take a little bit different route this evening. When I talk to you, the first thing we're going to do again is we're just going to take a deep breath once again and say, guess what? We made it through another week. Yay! Everybody give yourself a thumbs up. We've made it another week. So congratulations. So some of the trends that I've been seeing this week is, last week I said this isn't fun anymore. This week it's really not fun anymore. One of the things I'm hearing a lot from parents is that the kids are really starting to feel it now. And I think with the news that came this week that nobody's going back to school this year, I think that just kind of solidified this is our new normal, and it really isn't fun anymore. So what I'm hearing from parents is the kids are becoming more anxious and more emotional. They're seeing a lot more behavioral disruptions. They're seeing things in themselves, in their kids, that they don't normally see. So parents who are normally who have kids who are normally well behaved are finding kids are becoming more defiant. Kids who normally are pretty confident are becoming more anxious. And so I think there's more of a struggle, that this is becoming more real for kids who don't have the words to say, this is really hard. We're seeing an increase, again, in depression. So I think the first couple weeks were anxiety. I think we've now hit a point where people are starting to get more depressed rather than anxious. Then the other trend I'm seeing as parents and as kids are becoming more disruptive and parents are becoming more depressed, that they're trying to find a way to make this okay for their kids. They're trying to figure out how they're going to, we talked the first week about snowplow parents, how they're going to make this okay, how their kids don't have to struggle and suffer with this. And unfortunately, there's not a lot parents can do about that. So just a reminder on expectations, the other trend I'm hearing a lot about is people really still trying to do things at work, even that seem kind of ridiculous. I've heard a lot of people or employers who are offering their employees busy work just to simply give them something to do. And for parents, we really don't have time for busy work. We don't need to be doing trainings or taking on extra projects right now. Really, we're in survival mode. This is not really the time to become employee of the year. But really just to say, here are the things that are my priority, here what I can do, and here's what I can't do, and to be okay with that. So one of the questions, again, I think going through is, what is this? Is it depression? Is it living through a pandemic? What the heck is going on? And as Scott has said many times, this is an unknown. We've never been through a pandemic before. People are struggling with a lot of grief. People aren't going to see their kids graduate. People aren't going to do field day. Things that, again, I think we sometimes just take for granted are now coming down as real losses. We don't get to do them. The other problem is that if somebody comes in and they have depression, we have a whole series of strategies to help them deal with their depression. And that might be like, go hang out with your friends or start a new project. A lot of those things just aren't possible right now because of the social distancing and because of the restrictions. So it's really trying to figure out, how do we manage depression when we don't have all the tools available to us? I compared it to a client today that said it's like you're trying to win races in the swim team, but you can only practice in your bathtub. And that's really where we're at, and trying to figure out, how do we work around this with what we have available? So here's the dilemma is, again, if you look on one side, these are all the symptoms of depression that we use to diagnose depression. And on the other side are the things that people are reporting they're going through in the course of a pandemic. So I think this question of, is it depression? Is it truly a depression? Or am I just trying to navigate through this unknown? I think there's a lot of challenge in diagnosing what that is. You know, some of the things to think about when we talk about depression is really time frames. And to diagnose depression, we really need about 2 weeks of kind of these feelings of sadness and irritability. People who aren't struggling with depression, but more the grief and loss issues, seem to have more fluctuation, where they're feeling like, I'm okay, I can do this, and then having moments of despair instead of 2 chronic weeks of constant despair. Now, again, does that mean it can't get to that? I don't know. And I think that's one of the worries that mental health professionals have, is the more we isolate people, the more we take away their activities, the more we take away those things that help to keep people happy and healthy, the harder it's going to be to differentiate between what is truly depression and what is simply living through a pandemic. So I pulled up this screen last week. You know, again, when you can't do anything else, really to focus on the please, to take care of caring for your physical body, putting a clean shirt on, brushing your hair, brushing your teeth, managing your illnesses, thinking about eating, thinking about sleeping, thinking about exercise. We're going to talk a little bit more about the coping skills here in a minute. Related to DBT, again, the dialectical behavior therapy, is to say, again, what can we do when we can't do anything? And all we can do is sit and think about it and think about how awful this is and think about how this is never going to end. Well, here the accepts, the DBT skill of accepts gives us some ideas of what else can we do. So A stands for activities. Trying to find something to do. And I know you guys are all doing this right now anyway, but this could be reading or knitting or going for a walk. The activities is getting active, doing jumping jacks in your living room, anything to kind of move your body and do something else besides just sit there and think. Next, C stands for comparisons. And this one is always a challenge because it's really saying, well, it could always be worse. Well, it could be worse. You could be one of those people in the hospital, in the ICU. But that doesn't make us feel better. In fact, that makes us feel worse. So I think one of the things to think about from a comparison standpoint is changing it to gratitude. What are the things for which you're grateful? So really thinking about, it could be worse, but at least I'm here with my family, at least I'm healthy, at least I have good food to eat. Contributing. One of the things that is helping people is trying to help. Now it's different from other disasters like Hurricane Katrina. People could go out and they could build houses and they could really feel like they're making a difference. We're being told to stay home. So how do we make a difference when all we can do is stay home? And I think that's one of the things to think about is, can you contribute in some way? Maybe it's not doing anything more than staying home, which actually is contributing, but maybe you know how to sew and you can make masks. Or maybe you just can do a nice note or a card to your neighbor down the street. One of my neighbors actually built a life-size board game, a life-size chutes and ladders in his driveway out of sidewalk chalk for all the neighbors to use. So a way to contribute. E stands for emotions, which is doing the opposite of what you feel. So if you're feeling sad, don't put on a sad song or a sad movie. Put on a comedy, put on a horror movie, put on some Rage Against the Machine. Do something that triggers a different emotion. P, pushing away, is literally getting up and moving yourself. I'm not gonna sit here and think about this, I'm gonna move. I'm gonna move my body and move around. It can also be getting the thoughts out of your head. So one example is writing it down. T stands for thoughts, which is kind of the traditional counting sheep, but we can do this in any number of ways. Doing math problems, doing Sudoku, doing a crossword puzzle. I like to play a game where we go through and see if we can name food with every letter of the alphabet, or try and find somebody who has a birthday out of every month of the year. And so just giving our brain something else to do. Your brain is like a little toddler who wants to play with the power drill. You say, no, you can't play with the drill. Here's something else you can play with that's healthier and makes more sense. The final one is the sensations, which is one of the best ways to get out of our head is to get into our bodies. So how can you use sight, sound? Can you listen to some beautiful music? Can you taste something that tastes really good, maybe a strong mint? Do you have a candle? Do you have, again, petting dogs or petting your cat? Any sensation that is something different gets us out of our brains and into our bodies. The other thing that's difficult, that we know that relationships are one of the key ways that people maintain their happiness. And so really thinking about, what are we doing with relationships? For a lot of you, the people you're closest to are probably driving you insane right now. And so how do you manage that? So thinking about, these are people I love, what do I like about them, and how do I continue to be stuck around them for however long it's going to be? So thinking about this, about how we can manage that. One of the things you might want to do is, everybody in the house has their own safe space to say, you know what, if I'm sitting under the table, don't bother me. If I'm on the back porch, that's my cue to you to give me some space. But coming back and doing things like, here are the things I'm grateful for. Thank you for helping with the dishes while I had to take that phone call. Thank you for letting me finish those emails by jumping on the trampoline. So thinking about how you do that. Thinking also about, how are you extending this out? You don't have the same supports You may have. You don't have the option to go have happy hour with your girlfriends. You don't have after school pickup to talk about things with your friends. So what are you doing and how are you reaching out and maintaining those relationships? One of the ways we do this is something called social presence. And what social presence is how people communicate and how we vary. So on one end, we have the lowest level of social presence, which might be cards or letters, up to the highest level of social presence, which is face-to-face, and everything in between. So that might be a text message, that might be FaceTime. We can't do face-to-face, but what about if you made a card or a letter, even to somebody in your own home? So figuring out how we vary it, because I know, again, I do Zoom all day long. As much as I want to talk to my family, I don't want to hop back on Zoom. So what else can I do? Can I text message? Can I do something that doesn't require me to be present at that moment, like draw a card or picture? The second way we think about relationships is with something called community integration. And this is something that people miss. Like I said, saying hello to the other parents at the pickup, being with your church members, talking to your neighbors as you drive down the street. And so really thinking about how do we still feel like we're part of a community? So the community howl is a great way. You know, setting up a group chat for all the parents who do carpool together, just to kind of check in, just to say I'm still part of a community. Because I think those of us who are working really hard to stay at home for our community forget that we're part of the community. What do we do with all these feelings? Because a lot of us are having lots of anger, irritability, sadness, hopelessness. It's kind of all over the place right now. So thinking about, you have the choice of unhealthy coping skills, which vary for other people. We've heard a lot about people drinking too much. We've heard a lot of people talking about eating way too much. There was actually a study saying that people are sleeping a lot more than usual. And for some people, those might be healthy, but thinking about for you, do these help me to feel better? Or do they simply, as Scott said before, do they simply help me avoid? So some things we can think about that are always kind of more healthy defense mechanisms. One is laughter. Laughter is always a great way to kind of cope and makes us feel better. Again, going back to this altruism, how can I help others? Sublimation, which is expressing feelings in more acceptable choices. So again, like I said, a lot of the kids are having anger or aggression. Why not get a dodgeball game, a family dodgeball game going? And then you can work out a lot of your aggression. Then finally, kind of mindfulness awareness of really being able to think about how am I feeling right now? And what should I do with that? And maybe you don't do anything with it, but just simply sit with, wow, I am really angry about everything that's going on. And rather than fighting it, to simply just sit with it, which is challenging, but it also kind of makes it go away. I will say that if things get really bad, please remember that we do have crisis services available. And please reach out for help if you feel like this is more than I'm just struggling with the pandemic. We talked about this last week, is really focusing on your self-care plan and what will you do as a family, talking as a family about how we can take care of ourselves and how we can take care of each other. And what can we do to do that? Okay, and we got this. We'll keep going. We got this. So right now we want to invite you to join one of the other breakout rooms. We have a couple of options tonight. So if you would like to just get general support for anxiety, remain here. General support for depression is another room. Dr. Batt is going to be talking about medication, and Dr. Audrey Blakeley-Smith will be talking about children on the autism spectrum. I'm going to stop share so that Scott can pull up those other addresses. So again, if you want to stay here, you're welcome to do that. If you have other things to do, have a great night. And I'm going to hop out so I can go join my other room.